All right, so let's make something very clear from the get-go. This is not a call-out, a takedown, or any form of personal attack against Natalie Wynn or the Contrapoints channel. Discourse surrounding Natalie is often marred by so much baggage that it regularly becomes untenable and severely damages her mental health and the community at large. I know that many fellow NBs and trans folk take issue with her stances, and I think that that's fine and that she certainly has made mistakes. However, given the sheer amount of volatility that has emerged surrounding those criticisms in Natalie's Twitter comments, I thought that if I wanted to add to the conversation, it would instead be best to narrow the focus onto something more concrete and detached from Natalie as a person. We're going to discuss and criticize issues that I have with Natalie's most recent video on Cringe in particular. My perspective is defined particularly by my experiences with anthropology, neurodiversity, and transitioning as an AMAB. Just as we don't presuppose an author advocates for their characters, I'm going to treat Contrapoints and Natalie Wynn as two different people. Natalie has her own life and views that definitely overlap with, but almost certainly do not uniformly align with the characters she puts forward. We are not going to talk about Natalie Wynn today. If she sees this video, great. I hope the next time she broaches these subjects, she considers some of my misgivings about her execution in the video. But that's not really the point here, honestly. This video is about Contrapoints primarily because developing the tools to critique the work you love and respect is deeply necessary in order for everyone in the room to improve. And I think attempting to do so raises some really complicated questions about where video essays and left-tube videos fit into art criticism on the whole. The basic structure of this video is fairly straightforward. We're going to discuss the three main issues I took with this video in the order you can see on screen, and then broaden things out to consider why criticizing this kind of work is so uniquely challenging and hard to do without bringing a lot of toxicity to the table. You should absolutely watch her video before this one, but regardless, I'll try to make the arguments fairly clear if you haven't seen it in a while. Alright, let's begin. So near the beginning of the video, Contrapoints brings up a study conducted by Edmund Carpenter, a 20th century American anthropologist whose research focused on tribal cultures. Carpenter's study consisted of showing recorded images and mirrors to tribesfolk in New Guinea and gauging their responses. So for the record, the rule of thumb in a lot of academic circles is that sociology is for white people and anthropology is for everyone else. Yikes. I've met and studied with some wonderful anthropologists, and I think the field has changed a lot over the years into something quite exciting and beneficial to the community at large. But historically, anthropology totally sucks. My misgivings with her choice of study, though, extends beyond just a distaste for the field, particularly in the past tense. The point she specifically mentioned centralizes the act of white spectatorship on a non-white population and does not qualify that many anthropologists of this time made wild and grossly condescending observations of the people they studied. The research practice of studying a more primitive society to gauge the impact of modern technology on humans is deeply, deeply flawed. Probably need to make a video on that, but that's another issue, Jesus. Her main point that Cringe emerges from self-awareness could have been made without the inclusion of a fundamentally racist and flawed study. This does not negate her point majorly, and I don't think that she's advocating for Carpenter in the slightest, but I think that if this example just hadn't been there, the video would have been better for it. Treating these studies as legitimate insights into human behavior often gives more vindication to these practices than these academic works deserve. This section is going to be fairly short because slurs bad is a pretty simple argument to make. She uses the term "and" in her grand declaration as the ringmaster, and frankly there isn't much to say other than that she shouldn't have used those words, and they probably should have been omitted from a grandiose introduction about freakishness and deviancy. Unless she has access to these experiences in a way that I'm not aware of, these terms are kind of just toxic and they don't add anything to the point being made. She also says, on two separate occasions, one from the perspective of a rational skeptic animal avatar character, and one as a more flippant joke about the kinds of comments being made by the YouTuber Rose of Dawn in the character of Contrapoints. These just kind of feel like pretty simple mistakes that don't need to be there and mostly just made me kind of sad while I was watching the video. For context, I myself am neurotypical, but one of the people closest to me in my life is autistic. And I can't say that it brings me any comfort to see her make casual use of the term, even if she is playing the character of someone who would say it. The sentiment can be received without the word being said. Bringing these issues up kind of makes me feel like I'm being petty or making a big thing out of something fairly minor, but then I think about the fact that the person who is dear to me, that I mentioned before, probably wouldn't be able to watch this video because those remarks would set him off and make him quite upset. I think I want to point them out even more so because of the fact that if they weren't there, the discussion would be just as pertinent and meaningful, but more accessible. I am someone who believes that slurs belong to their victims, and I fully practice the reclamation of queer and trans slurs all the time. I don't include that kind of stuff in these videos because the normalization of those words to a broader audience might enable some choices in people without access to being trans and being queer. I don't think that, normalizing these terms on a broader level is a good idea. But in a queer or trans space, I'm kind of a slur-crazy menace. I mean, I'm foul-mouthed as it is, but I go especially hard when I'm around other queer folk. I know not everyone makes that their praxis, but it is a part of mine. All of this to say...
Ladies and gentlemen,
slurs bad.
So when Contrapoints discusses the GameStop controversy, I find that the way that she approaches gender norms in this section to be somewhat misguided, and her treatment of the human being behind the cringe was kind of uncomfortable to watch. It's weird too, because she handles herself very well in the prior section about Chris Chan, but still ends up feeding into the same mean-spirited energy she is deconstructing. I know she says she wants the sentiment rather than the words themselves to be the focus here, but even though the sentiment behind the joking about the GameStop lady's shoe size is a part of the point, that doesn't make it less toxic to consume. I don't blame her for candidly expressing her feelings, but some part of me can't help but feel kind of gross even indulging in that kind of treatment of another person, and I don't think that the act of explicating those thoughts so directly was necessary for the point to land. Contrapoints even brings up an example where she too was misgendered but wasn't an embarrassment to the trans community because she didn't handle it like a man. And while again this point serves to illustrate the exact mentality she is discussing, do we need to directly immerse ourselves in these forms of criticism to recognize their flaws? I don't think so. Sometimes the best medicine for a problem is to get away from it, or at least maybe a more detached approach. Embodying a problem as performance can be a meaningful way of analyzing and discussing it, but as we'll talk about later, with so many people embodying the problem already, it doesn't feel like her embodiment here adds to the conversation more than the toxicity of her words detract from it. Another issue I have is the idea of handling something in a masculine way when she's discussing the GameStop controversy woman. I think it's difficult to describe the feeling of being misgendered, especially in a public setting. I'm not saying that resorting to aggression as she does in the GameStop video is somehow acceptable. I even agree that part of it is likely to be male socialization imparting poor coping mechanisms, but that is kind of a really serious issue and a systemic problem in early transition AMABs, and I think writing it off is a poor choice, when instead it could have been used as a means of empathizing with and connecting with that person in an attempt to make the community better as a whole. It didn't need to be a point of mockery to illustrate her cringeworthiness in a way that I'm sure would be very dysphoric for her. I can't help but think about how painful it would be to be at your lowest point publicly only to be told by a fellow trans person that the way you handled your pain was very manly. I'm not saying we need to hold back to preserve others' feelings in all cases, but I don't think that it adds to the point to rub fucking gender salt in the gender wounds? Metaphors. I think the section kind of comes across as a means of venting some pretty negative feelings with an intellectual justification that doesn't make watching it any less hurtful. Again, I think this was a perfectly valid and well-reasoned choice on the part of Contrapoints to perform it this way. That doesn't change the fact that as a more masculine trans non-binary person, I genuinely can't find it in myself to feel that toxicity without wondering whether it's really necessary to have it there in the first place. Contrapoints kind of does exactly the kind of detached deconstruction I think the video is better suited for in her section about Rose of Dawn. She doesn't indulge Rose, but instead does an empathetic but detached discussion of her work and the ways that it relates to cringe obsession. Even still, I think this problem is compounded by the difficult blurring of lines between character and creator. In the section where she talks about the GameStop incident, Contrapoints appears to level with the viewer, letting us in on her darker feelings about the subject to make an example of herself. But whose feelings are these? The line between human being and character here feels impossible to parse, and on one level, I try to run like hell whenever I find myself indulging in a parasocial relationship, and yet I couldn't tell you who I'm criticizing here. You might have noticed in earlier points in my criticism it was sometimes kind of hard to tell who I was criticizing, and that wasn't really on purpose. It kind of just unintentionally turns into a criticism of Natalie, when in reality all I'm trying to do is critique what the character of Contrapoints is saying. When Contrapoints tells us a real, candid life story that happened to Natalie, who is the performer, and what does that do to the story itself? People who know performance studies might take a stance that both Natalie and Contrapoints are performers, and that they must both be analyzed as such. But who is the person on the screen? And when we don't even know which person is talking, is there even a difference? It's what makes video essays and LeftTube content so difficult to parse. I think there is a reason why an industry hasn't developed around criticizing and responding to these videos from the left. It's because they're monolithic in some way. They just kind of stand there as these cultural touchstones made by larger-than-life figures who, when we try and reach out and touch them, turn out to just be flashing pixels underneath a pane of glass. And when people delude themselves into thinking that they know these people personally, the consequences are deeply disturbing. But how then is someone supposed to come at these works in a form that isn't delusional or inflammatory? Can only another character respond to a character? Do we try treating these videos as a performative journalistic opinion column, and thus they can be criticized as documents of information with a definable origin? Yet if you reduce them purely to their words, the entire aesthetic that's been cultivated here, what makes these works so uniquely engrossing, vanishes for the sake of analysis. You don't analyze a film just by looking at the script. All of this to say that I think we need to push ourselves to have these conversations a little harder, because everyone will improve if there's a constructive dialogue that bridges the inevitable gaps in these works. I think many of these videos deserve their own pseudo-intellectual book clubs, frankly. With the amount of research and time put into these videos, you could have so many discussions about them as pieces of film and as political and philosophical texts. Not to say that these works are always magical, groundbreaking super essays, but I, for one, find engaging with and creating them fun and rewarding. I know I'm not the only one, considering the size of the audience these videos garner. Who knows where this whole LeftTube and video essay thing will go from here, but let's end the video with a question, and I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments. In building a framework to analyze video essays and LeftTube-style think pieces, how would you consider and analyze the relationship between the creators themselves and the often candid, pseudo-genuine personae they take on to deliver their message? I hope to hear your thoughts on this one, because I, for one, am pretty stumped on where to start. Thanks for watching, please subscribe, and I hope to see you again soon.
好きよ好きよ好きよ